You are listening to an After Dinner Conversation magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we have created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story, Audiobooks, provides audiobook recordings of stories that have appeared in our magazine, and our companion podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story, Discussions, is where we discuss the ethics of the choices made in the stories as a way to model the kinds of discussions we hope you're having about these readings with friends, family, or students. I'm Colby, your narrator, and the creator of After Dinner Conversation Publishing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast and for reading the magazine. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com/afterdinnerconversation.com. Today's story is His Neighbor's Wife by Bryan Starchman. The autumn air was crisp as the Subaru idled in the residential street. Despite the early hour, the enforcers lined the sidewalks, passive as they fulfilled their obligation. They were there to witness the act and were not to engage with the players in any way unless the victim faltered. It was time for vindication. The law would be upheld. After a brief discussion, they agreed that a chain would be attached to a thick metal stake driven deep into the asphalt. There was concern that the residents might burst their tires on the protruding inch of steel, but it was only temporary. As soon as justice had been served, the stake would be removed, along with the broken body of the young boy. He whimpered in the road, his ankle firmly held by the metal cuff. The chain was so short that he could only pace in small circles around his anchor. They had decided that it would be cruel to give him any length to run with, and so he sat in the road and stared past the idling car. The driver, a Miss Weston, could see the boy sitting in the road, but just barely. She had set her starting position nearly 3 blocks from the scene of the crime. She wanted to gain enough speed to ensure that his death was instantaneous. The boy sat panting, panicked, screaming in the exact spot where Miss Watson had cried over the remains of her own child just 12 hours ago. There was still a burgundy stain where her daughter's blood had flowed. So much blood. How could a 5-year-old's body contain so much fluid? This thought steadied Miss Weston. It grounded her, and she felt a sense of peace as she shifted her car into drive. She focused on a spot beyond the boy, a house at the end of the cul-de-sac, and then she accelerated. She did not look at the boy as the enforcers stood witness, but she felt the terrible shudder of the car as the tires split open his skull. She turned around in the cul-de-sac, parked in her own driveway, and, a little shaken, she entered the house she shared with her grieving husband. As the enforcers removed the boy's body, a fire truck blasted away the boy's blood, and the steel pin was removed from the asphalt. Miss Weston entered her dead daughter's room, collapsed on the child-sized bed, and wept. In the year 20, the law of vindication had recently been adopted by all 57 states. The president had run a Levitical law and order platform, and soon after his inauguration the new law was introduced to Congress. The death penalty was still illegal in many states, but evidence showed that it did little to deter criminals. And so the law of vindication. If a burglar shot your wife during a home invasion, you were legally obligated to take revenge and kill the burglar's wife or comparable loved one. If a husband killed his wife, her parents must exact revenge on their son-in-law. Or in the case of Miss Weston, if a drunk driver ran down your child in the middle of the street, and so on and so on. And the families were given recommendations on how to exact revenge. Every citizen was registered with the Ministry of Psychology, and the victim's loved ones would receive a report revealing the condemned's greatest fears. If the family truly wanted justice, they could use acid, fire ants, or snapping turtles, within reason, of course. The enforcers were your neighbors, your colleagues, the residents of your town. They lived with you and had an interest in keeping the peace. Everyone over the age of 18 was mandated to stand watch within their own jurisdiction and witness the retaliations. And if, for some reason, a grieving parent or spouse, in a moment of weakness or moral superiority, could not exact revenge, the enforcers would complete the task. Once the judgment had been passed, the people would swiftly and mercilessly eliminate the assailant's loved one for the good of all. Of course, there were caveats and mistakes would be made, but the people seemed willing to accept the prospect of innocent casualties in exchange for the promise of a more peaceful society. A drug addict strung out on monkey shade was not likely to take time to pause and think about his own family as he held up a convenience store clerk at gunpoint. Should the addict's family suffer? Should they have their guts blown apart by a shotgun? Or should the addict be shot while his family members are forced to take the same drug that tore his world apart? Would that teach the society to seek help for their fellow addicts? To insist on rehab and interventions and treatment? The law of vindication was in its infancy, and the courts would have to adapt as the criminals tried to undermine its intended use. But after a year, premeditated homicide was down 42%. Drunk driving had also dropped significantly, as had armed robbery. There would always be fringe criminals, the psychotics and sociopaths. But no law could curtail the truly insane. After all, the law of vindication had made effective social change, and that was better for all. The argument was not about the dishes. When Harold's wife, Margaret, told him to wash the goddamn dishes, it was the proverbial straw that broke her husband's back. And after she stormed out of the room and returned to the entertainment nook where she immersed herself in her digital mind wall stories of the Scottish Highlands, Harold reached for the largest knife in the kitchen. He was ready to stab Margaret through her black heart and watch her bleed out while her mind was still trapped in her virtual world, but he stopped as he remembered the morning's news blasts. A man in Cleveland had strangled his wife last night, and already the Court of Vindication had passed sentence. The Ministry of Psychology identified his greatest fear, and within hours his brother-in-law was melting his flesh with a government-issued flamethrower as the enforcers looked on. As Harold fingered the knife, he imagined his own father-in-law's sadistic grin. He wouldn't give the son of a bitch the satisfaction. Not today. And so the knife was slid back into the block, and Harold washed the dishes. But instead of powering on his CES, cochlear entertainment system, he decided for once to stew in his own thoughts. It was too easy to get lost in the fantasy stories of F.D. Ruffino, and he did not want to let his wife off the hook. He was relishing his anger. For too long he'd given up his own identity while trying to conform to Margaret's warped concept of an ideal husband. Charismatic and social, but also quiet and present. Fit and well-dressed, but also willing to go out for drinks and fried chicken and sharing 2 desserts. Faithful and steadfast, but sultry and sensual and dangerous. A list of contradictions led to a wife who was never satisfied, and instead of liking Harold for who he was, she ended up resenting him for all the things he was not. And then today, his birthday, he had the entire day planned out so that he could be by himself. He wouldn't have to check his posture or his dictation or his tone. He could just be Harold, out on the lake, drinking beer, his baited hook floating 20 feet below the boat, not caring if he caught anything as his CES whisked him away to a land of talking goats and gnomes. But it didn't work out that way. It never worked out that way that Harold planned. Because he had chosen to spend a life sentence with Margaret, and she had bawled hysterically at the thought of her husband spending his birthday alone. But it's what I want for my birthday, he tried to explain. Don't be stupid. No one wants to be alone on their birthday. I do. You just don't want to be with me for your birthday. It's not that. It was that. And so Margaret insisted that what he really wanted for his birthday was for her to make him his favorite breakfast, French toast with strawberries, he was allergic, and a yogurt smoothie, also lactose intolerant. And after he had gorged himself and his throat was swollen and his bowels were churning, she told him to do the dishes. It was the least he could do after he had received such a generous gift from his wife. With the last dish dried and put away, Harold was amazed and a little frightened to find that he hadn't calmed down. Usually a little time away from Margaret would cool his rage, but not today. Not on his birthday. This was what he would have to endure for the rest of his life. And so he pulled the knife back out of the butcher block and crossed the yard to his neighbor's house. Lily answered the door. She was a pretty little thing, far too narrow in the hips for Harold, but she had these big doe eyes that seemed to have been drawn on her face by an illustrator. She was newly married to Daniel Grant, a straw-haired architect with an all-American smile. Harold and Margaret had gifted them a blender. They had become friendly due to their close proximity. Harold could hear the young couple making love most evenings and on weekend mornings. Lily could hear Harold and Margaret screaming at each other 7 days and nights a week. Lily had just finished baking some cupcakes for Harold, and before she could even wish him a happy birthday, he plunged the knife into Lily's chest. As Harold waited for the enforcers to take him to the court of Vindication, he smiled. Tonight he would have the entire king-sized bed all to himself. All rise, the Honorable Justice Wilshire presiding over the case of Harold Bloomington in the premeditated murder of Lily Grant. Only a few hours ago, Harold had watched the life seep out of his neighbor's wife's chest, and now he was ready to be judged under the new law. He felt a little sorry for his neighbor Daniel. He had seemed genuinely in love with Lily, but Harold also felt pleased with himself for being so clever that he had found a way to legally get rid of Margaret. He saved quite a bit of money by defending himself. Who needs a lawyer when you're willing and ready to plead? Guilty, Your Honor. I stabbed Lily Grant through the heart at 9:47 this morning, and I fully understand that the law of vindication I must pay with the blood of my own beloved wife. Margaret charged down the aisle towards the defense table, screaming, "You son of a bitch! I can't believe that I've wasted the best years of—" But her threats were cut short by a stun baton. Harold grinned as her unconscious body was removed from the courtroom by an enforcer he recognized from behind the deli counter of the grocery store. The judge was grinning too, but not at the removal of Margaret. His eyes were boring into Harold, and suddenly Harold was overwhelmed with a sense of dread. That is not the letter of the law, Mr. Bloomington. You murdered the love of Mr. Grant's life, and in turn he will be vindicated when he kills the love of your life. Harold looked at the judge like he was some sort of illiterate. He answered very slowly, "Yes, Your Honor, and that cold fish that was unceremoniously dragged out of here is the love of my life." "You are married to her," the judge retorted, "but do you love her?" "Not a bit." "It is clear to this court that you love yourself more than you ever loved your wife, and so the victim's husband must kill you in the way that you would fear most. Are you ready, Mr. Grant?" Daniel Craig appeared from the judge's chambers. Harold had wondered why the grieving husband hadn't been present for the judgment. His eyes were red and puffy as he glared at Harold. Suddenly the enforcers, Harold's friends and neighbors, were holding him down. He began to panic, but he couldn't move. Someone had removed his pants, and Daniel Grant was advancing on him with a power drill aimed at his scrotum. And under the whine of the drill and the animal screams coming from Harold, Daniel Grant was muttering to himself, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." The end. Discussion questions. Number 1. If implemented, do you think the punishment method in the story would cut down on crime? If so, then why don't we use methods like this? What is the purpose of criminal punishment if not to deter crime? Number 2. If this were the punishment laws in your country, would you participate in their enforcement? What if failing to participate in their enforcement meant you were in violation of the law and subject to punishment? Number 3. Do you think punishment like the one in the story could ever, over time, be seen as normal? How do you decide what normal punishments are versus those that are cruel and unusual? Number 4. If someone you loved were murdered or raped, would you want this type of vindication punishment to be enforced against the criminal, or would you prefer a more traditional punishment like jail time? And question number 5. What do you think a fair punishment would have been for the main character in this story? And that concludes our story for today. Next week, we'll have a new story, The Waiting Room. If you enjoyed this story, head over to our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, and listen to our discussions of this and other short stories from our magazine. We'll include a link in the description. And of course, you can always continue the discussion on our webpage in the comments section and on our Facebook page. Thank you for joining us. Bye.